Bonjour tout le monde, hello everyone. Je suis extrêmement heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour cette nouvelle conférence virtuelle de l'initiative IA plus Société et du Centre de recherche en droit, technologie et société de l'Université d'Ottawa. I'm delighted to welcome you today for a new virtual talk of the AI and Society Initiative and of the Center for Law, Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin Barreto. I'm an associate professor of law and the University Research Chair in Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa, where I lead the Center for Law, Tech and Society, as well as the AM Society um, initiative. So I'm delighted to host today's conversation about the intersection of AI and competition law. Like the latest rapid advancements in AI have introduced new challenges for our competition regulators in Canada and around the world, who seem, especially in Canada, to be inadequately in a position to detect and address some of the anti-competitive behaviors in the ecosystem domestically or from foreign company, and so the impact it may have on AI ecosystem and markets. And so in this context, the failure to take regulatory action risk allowing some dominant companies to extend then dominance into AI and the platform economy and like other market where we have already like a lot of asymmetric advantages and asymmetry of information. So everything is changing, and as an election is looming, we may soon have a new government, a new parliament, at least a new session of parliament, and they will have to tackle this in the middle of a trade war with the US and of a reconfiguration of the global context and of technology geopolitics, especially as we've seen during the AI Action Summit in Paris early January, with like a total like reconfiguration of the space that will have an impact on like the main actors, on the market, on the ecosystem. And so we thought of hosting this conversation today, that it was very timely to discuss the scale of like big tech in the space and of anti-competitive behaviors, and delve into the role of the Competition Bureau and the changes, the last changes and maybe the upcoming one, what we need to change in the Competition Act, in the competition framework in Canada, considering those new developments in Canada and around the world. And for this conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by three great thought leaders in the space in Canada. So today you will hear from René Black, who is the founder and CEO of Goodbot, which launched in 2023 to advance proactive digital policy and inclusive digital futures where democratic society can thrive. And under the umbrella of Goodbot, René led one of the submissions to the consultation of the Competition Bureau, and we will have time to unpack a bit kind of the key finding in a few minutes. We'll also hear from Vas Bednar, who is the executive director of the McMaster University's Master of Public Policy in the Digital Society program. She's a senior fellow at CG and writes a very popular newsletter, Rags to the Riches, and has been, very vocal on many of those issues in Canada. And last but not least, I'm delighted to have my colleague, Jennifer Quaid, join this conversation. Jennifer is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law, Civil Law section at the University of Ottawa, and she teaches criminal law, competition law, and business law, and also been like very involved, like René and Vas, in all of those conversations about like AI and competition, and good behaviors from or not good behaviors from corporate actors in the space. So thank you again for the three of you to join today. And without further ado, I will jump into our conversation for first question to René, but like for the people in attendance, I will invite you to use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask your question, and we may I have a few questions for René, and Jennifer, but I might feed your question in our conversation, or a bit later on. And also you can activate closed caption during this conversation. And the conversation will be, la conversation sera principalement en anglais. Néanmoins, vous pouvez aussi activer l'outil de traduction en français, de traduction automatique en français de Zoom dans vos préférences système. So this like a bit of housekeeping to make sure that everyone, can follow our conversation. And so let's kick off with you, René. And so as I mentioned in my introductory remark, last year Goodbot led a submission to the consultation on competition in digital age. And so could you, and I know that René and Jennifer, join you in this work. And so could you maybe help us set the stage first by exposing the main points of contention about the harms we are seeing in the marketplace by those dominant players and like the concentration of power with tech firms.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really pleased to be here and excited for this conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think we were sort of starting from the point of view, we come at a lot of these things from the point of view of consumers and societies, but we also understand that markets play a really important role in these conversations and in sort of accountability. And so we were coming at this from the point of view of how do we think about competition and playing a role in helping to get to technologies that are in the best interest of society and that enable healthy market competition. Goodbot and my prior organization, Peace Geeks, did a lot of work looking at the role of platforms and how they were intermediating our lives and spaces. And now that AI companies are coming into the picture, they're not only dominating large language models, they're also moving into other areas of their existing markets where they have dominance. So, for example, for Google, that might include ads, and sort of extending their dominance there, driving out a lot of competition within that value chain. And then they're also, in a position to extend that dominance deeper in those value chains. So both horizontal and vertical, dominance in ways that are very hard for people and, others to hold accountable. And so we feel this is a risk, and we feel that competition, enables choice that allows people and businesses to make good choices, but only when that happens in a context where there's informed choice. And so we really see competition as a way to make sure that markets are healthy, that consumers have good choice, and especially in this moment in time where our sovereignty is being placed at risk, where our technology infrastructure is dominated by not only a few companies but also mainly one country. That kind of both creates some vulnerabilities, but I also hope it creates some opportunities for Canadian innovators to start jumping in and trying to offer some alternatives. And we're seeing some of that happening in the EU right now, and I really hope to see that happening in Canada too.
Cool, thank you. And so, last year when you did this submission, we could argue that, it was a very different world and time, like both on the technological side, like so much happened, but also like on the geopolitical side, like we were after the Bletchley Summit, it was like, it was another ambiance than at the Paris Summit. It was before the trade war, and as you mentioned, like so many of those actors are like south of our border, and it might have quite an impact. And so, and maybe this question would be for you, Jennifer. What kind of implication do you see for Canada? From a regulatory perspective, and maybe the habit of Canada to look at south of the border for some like leadership in the space, and maybe like kind of what models of example you see like changing or should change in our approach to this issue.
Thanks, Florian. It's really great to see everyone here, and I'm glad to see so many people listening in. The answer to your question has to start, I'm going to play the professor role here a little bit. It has to start a little bit with what was before I could talk about now. I think it's important to remember that, we're talking about two topics that overlap but are not coextensive. And a lot of the challenge, and I mean, that started when I first wrote a chapter for the book that you and Teresa edited, was figuring out where that overlap is. And actually it required some new terminology and ways of sorting out what we're talking about. I think one of the challenges is that the notion of AI is extremely large and has become a kind of acronym we wave at for lots of things without being very precise about it. And then competition law itself and competition policy are, also have an ambit. I've always started with that first because it's smaller. But we have to remember that competition law has a particular vocation in Canada, and it's really about the framework that governs, competitive behavior in competitive markets. So, spoiler alert, normative statement here. The Competition Act and the existence of a Competition Act is predicated on the idea that we have basically a market capitalist system. So capitalism is the underlying sort of set of economic choices that hold our system together. And so the idea that contestable competitive markets are the best way for scarce resources to be organized is kind of baked into that, right? What has been perhaps, part of the conversation in the reform that happened over the last sort of 2 years, from 2022 to 2024 over 3 different bills, was a little bit of a widening of the conversation about whether or not, simply allocative efficiency, what we call it, how well are we using the resources we have, and how big is the pie? Is that a sufficient kind of guidance? And there's still quite a lot of debate about that. I'm not going to get into that unless there are questions. But competition is fundamentally about economic activity, about business activity, business practices. It's not an overarching piece of legislation that covers all segments of society. By contrast, the influence of the technologies that have been developed based on algorithms, analysis of data, and so forth do spread completely across society. So with that in mind, traditionally, Canada has sat between Europe and the United States on a number of economic and business regulatory issues, not just competition law. In competition law, we have sort of historical links to, the American approach. We, like only a minority of countries, use the criminal law in our competition law, for example. And so we do have a lot of resemblances, kind of at the idea of sort of how we approach it. However, there's a big difference just structurally, which is that Canada has this unusual law, I would say, the one that was enacted in 86 when we went from totally criminal to a mix of criminal, civil, and administrative. And that is that we have a lot of detail in our law. The Americans have a couple of very old statutes that just keep getting reinterpreted and on which enforcement guidance is applied. And that enforcement guidance can vary quite substantially from administration to administration. Things can be more emphasized, less emphasized, and so forth. On the European side, they do have more rules and more of an approach, but we haven't, they don't have the criminal law side, and they have historically also been, and I think it's important to remember this, and Florian, you know this far more than me, the European competition law, and, which is the thing we pay attention to the most, even though there is competition law in the member states, is about and in the service of the European market. So there is a larger sort of political economic dimension to that, which isn't always this analogous to Canada. So bringing that down to the answer here is that on competition, we have tended to try to hew closely to the Americans, even though there are differences in approach. And the reform was very definitely influenced by what was, what the policy direction was under the Biden administration with the executive order, Lena Khan sitting in the FTC chair, Jonathan Cantor at the Antitrust Division. Now we've changed our law and there's a whole new administration south of the border, changes in, who's in charge of the enforcement agencies. It's not clear yet exactly how concretely, like what's going to change, but we are going to have to move forward with what was a pretty aggressive agenda without necessarily being able to rely on the Americans to cut a path for us. So that's going to be interesting to see, can we own what we did or not? On AI, contrary to that, we looked to Europe because the Americans really at the state level have been active, but not at the federal level. But that didn't work. So we are in a position where we're now closer to the Americans because we have nothing. or not very much. I know there's AI experts out there going to say, yeah, there's things, but there isn't a framework legislation. There isn't a general governance framework. There's still a debate about how within the division of powers you would organize this. And so what you've got is, strangely, we might have to be looking in a different direction for guidance on both of these things. But it's clear that Canada typically wants to be within the conversation of what is being discussed with its economic peers, which tends to be the G7 plus a couple of other key jurisdictions like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. But that's where we sit now. The current instability means that we may have to do some of this work ourselves or seek out different partners than we have habitually sought out.
Yeah, exactly. And as you mentioned, like, the geopolitics changed everything. And like in the EU, like competition law was also a political tool to both like build the EU and like kind of harmonize some of the practices, but also kind of like protect the EU and, EU citizens from like some of the big tech, and making sure everything is interoperable and there is no like the discourses. Well, it's not recent, but like more and more you can hear about like digital sovereignty within the EU. And I think for the past week, we saw those kind of like narrative and discourse being used in Canada, both by like industry, but also by the government. So I think, yeah, it's interesting, and it might be welcome to look somewhere else than in the US. And also, yeah, another issue is like enforcement. You mentioned this, and I think we can all think about like the Facebook, a consent decree that seems like big for Canada within the framework of what we can do in Canadian competition law, but the fine was nothing for Facebook, and compared to the kind of fine they can have in the US. And so, Jeffrey, you mentioned like kind of AI is everywhere. There is like kind of different sector approach, etc. And so maybe Vas, if you could like kind of help us see, like unpack on the sector specific level, maybe how it's playing out. Do we see like some difference? Is there maybe some different opportunities or some spaces where it might be easier to kind of like take all this and take the lead? Should competition law consider like some of the output of those players, and like, yeah, can we have a bit of hope?
Yeah, like let me try, right? I love that my question is like, what are some easy policy things we can do?
Exactly.
Put me in, coach. How many webinars do I have to do before I can just audit Professor Quaid's courses? Because I always learn so much from her, and I'm so happy to be here and always hearing from Renee. I know I'm just applying to audit. And I do want to say, the Competition Bureau is very alive to examining AI in competition. It was the subject of their summit this past fall. And, Renee, you contributed a submission. I don't even know how I'm allowed on the webinar because I did not write a submission on AI in competition to the Bureau, despite their beautiful invitation to anyone in Canada to do so. I did write a chapter on AI in competition like 8 different times, and I contribute in my own small ways. So to the Bureau, thank you for your work, and we're all doing our part in different ways. What's going on in different sectors? What can we see in terms of the application of these technologies? I mean, one thing that my co-author Denise Hearn and I like to bring forward is that algorithms regulate markets, right? Increasingly, they are a form of micro kind of market regulation. What's often presented to us, and I have my little engaging debates online with people on the internet where I do learn a lot, to be fair, is this idea that you either have government regulation, which is red tape bad. Side note: look at the history of red tape, and it actually was used to signify folios of government importance. So, RIP to the good red tape. Here we are. Or you have the absence of any regulation at all, right? Actually, that algorithmic curation in terms of what we see, though people will insist there's that freedom, there's that aspirational aspect to it. Oh, it's my feed, it's my playlist. I have power over this, right? I've influenced this. No, we don't. This is not a democratic or transparent form of power, and it's a power that fundamentally constrains access to markets for all sorts of people. So I think that curatorial ability of AI is important to think about in terms of how it can make, reshape, and manipulate markets. Give you two other sort of little things to think about. One, and we do know that the Bureau is alive to this, but the application of algorithms to either negotiate or collude with other algorithms or be deployed to kind of micro calibrate prices to the individual is an area of fascination for me. And we know that the Bureau is conducting an investigation or taking a look at the application of Real Pages, a corporate landlord's application of algorithmic pricing to potentially manipulate rental markets. Now, just setting that aside, rental markets are actually kind of a really interesting space, I think, to look at algorithmic pricing. I do think there's a universe where you could imagine, bear with me for 1 second, a public algorithm that it works to moderate rents, right? Cap the growth of rents, set rents in a way that absolves independent micro kind of mom and pop landlords. I'm not actually like hardcore pitching that as a policy agenda. I'm just saying rental markets are a market where we're used to a lot of flexibility and dynamism, and that there could be a role for technology there, technology for good. But I'm very interested in how pricing, right? Firms have always had the ability to set prices. I know that that's not new, but I think we're inhibited in terms of understanding and appreciating the inputs that go into pricing when they are set for us. And I do think people expect a certain kind of stability or uniformity in terms of a shelf price being the same for different people. And we're seeing the erosion of that, right? And the third thing, just sector by sector, and I hope I'm not taking too much time, but I think this is like a cool example. It's like a fun example. So
Go for
problem,
it.
not enough competition in Canada. We need more. Solution, I hear it all the time. Very simple, actually, just two things. First word, more. Second word, competition, right? Easier said than done. What the heck does that mean, right? What does it mean to have more competition? Is it just one more competitor? And we ignore the structural realities of a market, right? Why don't we have that one extra grocer we've been dreaming of in Canada? And something Denise and I took a look at was the dilution of audio from AI generated music, synthetically generated material, fake music. Now, what's interesting to me about fake music is that just kind of like CanCon, it's hard to know like how fake does something have to be fake, right? So if you use a computer program to like generate a beat, is that an entire AI song? Put that aside. We know that a platform like Spotify, and I really recommend the new-ish Liz Pelly book. She's an American journalist. She wrote Mood Machine, which is about how Spotify has changed music markets, payouts, but also kind of incentivized a more kind of bland, inoffensive music, right? Because it's a platform that competes with silence. You know, we listen based on the vibes, and it's a place that we trust, right? It's a place that we feel like maybe we're discovering new music. And the reason I bring it up in the context of more competition is because audio is a space we see a lot more competition. And I think you can still sometimes smell AI generated material, maybe when you're reading it, maybe in the classroom, for better or for worse, or some of those images, right? They're a little bit flat, but audio is basically impossible to discern. And maybe it brings forward policy opportunities that are just around basic transparency and disclosure. But I do think we need to look at how the infusion of synthetic material remakes, dilutes, and reshapes markets, because is the future of music one where humans aren't making it and aren't being remunerated? I don't think so, and I hope not, but we're starting to sort of see some of those clues. So that's my kind of like, we were trapped in an elevator. It wasn't an elevator pitch. It was the elevator broke down and you got stuck with me in the elevator for my answer.
But that was like a great answer, and like you point on like a few issues also, like, you know, in the cultural and creative industries, where like we have some of the major players now kind of like using some of the, you know, clauses in the contract to reuse like the likeness of and like the work of some like authors, and so at which point it's like, we're moving from like copyright to actually like anti-competitive like behaviors over the market, replacing actors. So that's no, I think there might be like new areas of interest for like intersection of competition and AI
And
that we might not have used in the past.
just to chase myself for 1 second, I meant to say that in theory, I think this is an area that Canada should be interested in from a regulatory perspective, right? If we're going to introduce a form of competition policy, which is the Online Streaming Act, and focus on discoverability, that's because we were trying to remake power, rebalance power in these streaming markets, right? We weren't forcing anyone to consume more CanCon. We were saying we want to do something so that there's at least more of that option. But are we going to set a floor for, payouts and remuneration? There's way more policy experimentation and proposal in the US than there is here. It's just not a conversation here.
Mhm. And so in this overlap and the kind of conversation we should have in Canada, maybe Jennifer, if I can come back to you, and there was like many areas of overlap, and so where do you see maybe competition law being able to like assist us to like support an incentive structure that would motivate people, businesses to invest in create innovation in Canada that would stay in Canada based on AI, while also promoting markets and like the global economy and technological and economic sovereignty for Canada. It's a complex like balance, but yeah. Do you have like some ideas, some thoughts on how we could do this? Again, I'm asking you like, let's solve Canadian issues like today over lunchtime.
There won't be any magic solutions, but here are some things I've been thinking about. And you're right that, I come back to the overlap point, and I didn't want to belabor it too much, but there is a question like Vaz alluded to with regard to how algorithms may be ultimately sort of influencing how markets work. And so one of the really interesting issues that's being looked at, and a colleague of mine at the University of Montreal, Pierre Larouche, wrote a really good submission on this point. There is both demand side and supply side things to think about. And when we talk about competitive markets, we really ultimately like the sweet spot you want is where the market works such that, those who are seeking things get what they want from those who are offering them. And, the reality is that not all markets work perfectly, but the belief remains, although I think not everyone believes it anymore, that markets normally work. Like normally there is an incentive to provide what people want, because then they're your customers. But one of the interesting things about AI that I think is making it a little bit more tricky to analyze these things is to what extent does AI actually change how those markets work. And so the concept I'm going to throw out here, it's like all the economists will know what I'm talking about, is the market distortion. There is a sort of idea that, it's kind of, I won't say it's like gravity, but let's say it's analogous to gravity. There's some things that should hold, like there's sort of economic tenets of how things work. And what AI may be doing is displacing some of those tenets, like and that's what we worry about, because then the contestable market we imagine is not going to emerge. So one example is where, to riff off of the rent setting algorithms, the argument is, oh, but this will be so good because it will, ultimately the information about rents, people will set the rents at the rates where people are willing to pay. Well, that's actually not what's happening. And so there's a human factor in that, which is that, well, depending on what you set as your objective for that algorithm, you may or may not actually be aiming to offer the demand side what they want. You may be trying to figure out what you can get away with. And what happens when everyone discovers that there's this great algorithm that works really well to figure out, what's the right rent to seek that we can keep increasing, and everyone starts using the base architecture that's of that algorithm? Like, then you actually have everyone using the same product, and the chances for uniformity in how the market works are suddenly, invisible, but very much there. And, do we truly have market mechanisms that can that can counter that. That's the first point. The second point is about price discrimination, which a lot of people talk about. And it's called first order price discrimination, where you basically can figure out exactly what somebody wants, exactly how much they're going to pay for it, and you can charge them exactly that price. Well, as most people know, what that means is that, the sense we get that we got a deal, I was willing to pay more, but I paid less, whatever, disappears. The consumer surplus is entirely extracted to the consumer, to the producer. The counter argument has always been, oh, but there are ways for consumers to fight back. They can check other offers, they can go look for other things, whatever. But in a world that is mostly online, and although AI is not necessarily always in an online space, it often is, your ability to check those things and to engage in that kind of behavior is limited. So one of the things we worry about in competition law is, are our assumptions about how the economy works still valid? And if they are, to what extent? And that may be the direction, I can't speak for the Bureau, but I know that the Bureau has a digital intelligence unit and they're looking at these things. So that's, the bigger question of is the economy different in ways that matter to how we think about how markets work? That's one set of problems. The second set, and then I'll stop talking, is, there are sort of AI specific considerations within each area of interest for the Bureau. So the Bureau has sort of 4 key areas of interest. The first one is, what we call deceptive marketing. And although people think of it as consumer law, it's really more about making the market fair and that there isn't free riding, people lying and getting away with it, right? That sort of idea of being able to sell things, promising and not delivering. The second area is what we call sort of reviewable practices, but the big centerpiece is abuse of a dominant position, right? Then you have merger control, and finally you have cartels. And there's a civil version of cartels, but I mean, basically cartels are getting together and, cheating the system. What's interesting about that is we've added little hints at the way the economy has changed, little hints at things that concern us in this economy that maybe weren't so much the case before. Things like network effects, nascent competitors, privacy impacts, data considerations. But it's not clear yet really how that's all going to play out. I think what's going to be interesting, and I'll end on that because it allows me to just close the loop on something that you commented about earlier. There's a case right now against Google that the Bureau has brought, and it's dealing with its ad tech and its ad stack, and I'm not going to go into the gritty detail, but it's the first opportunity we have to see the new provisions being applied in real time. And some of those provisions dealt with sort of focusing a little more on the digital economy and on, digital artifacts of economic activity. So we'll see where that goes in terms of its interpretation. But you mentioned the low administrative monetary penalty applied in the Facebook consent agreement. Well, since that time, of course, the penalty amount has increased substantially. But what has happened in the Google case is we've just had, just about a month ago, notification of a constitutional question. And now administrative monetary penalties are being challenged under the charter. Now, that's a question that goes beyond competition law in theory, but it just goes to show that once you change the stakes, and once you change the enforcement environment, you might get different reactions. So I think there's sort of a couple of sets of problems. On the one hand, it's like, is AI actually remaking the economy in ways that now violate what were the sort of economic 101 principles? And do we want that? That's the second thing. And there are whole sets of considerations that influence how we analyze existing practices and how much needs to change there. And the Bureau is working very hard on that. I don't want to suggest that nothing is happening on that front, but I mean, it's all to be charted and to be determined.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this comprehensive answer. And yeah, thank you for highlighting this, the latest case. And I would say it might be actually a very positive signal for the Kenyan framework, because if they're so to just be ready to sign a check, we don't recognize any wrong, and we can continue to do what we have been doing for years. And now they start to oh, there might be some constitutional issues. It means that we may have the Bureau might finally have the tool to kind of regulate the market and act upon it. So I see the time flying. I have 2 more questions, but also we have a lot of questions from the audience. But I would like to maybe come back to some of those the geopolitical context, and Jennifer, you mentioned some of the theories about like the market being like naturally competitive, but like, can we really say that for the AI, especially like of a lot of, in Canada, a lot of the initial startups leading the way have been like bought up by like the big tech, and they know like, owned by Google, by Meta, by Amazon. And so maybe I would like to go back to you, Renee, and maybe have your thoughts on like how maybe we can use competition law for this. And do you feel that is like, incumbent on Canada to build is digital sovereignty like this, and not to be so reliant, on the US? And could maybe competition law be a way to make sure that, we have like a thriving Canadian ecosystem that will be like better for consumers and citizens? Because, as you're mentioning, some issues with deepfake, also like audio deepfakes and stuff, it's often seen as like, an economic issue, but also like a democratic one, especially as coming into an election, if we don't have, transparency tools and labeling and stuff, it might be an issue in our upcoming election. But yeah, so going back to the economics of it, maybe Renee, if you could share your thought on this with us.
I mean, I think that, just thinking about what we have not seen, but has been part of the conversation around platforms. I mean, I want to maybe just emphasize something that feels like it's fundamental to everything, which is transparency obligations. So having access to understand what is going on within some of these platforms, disclosure around around when AI is being used, and then some auditability, some access to reports, within the AI's Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. There's some obligations to report on certain aspects of how platforms are working. Bas brought up the fact that our sort of experiences in platforms are sort of mitigated by algorithms in ways that give us the sort of perception of agency, but really that ends up being a bit of a false dynamic. And so, I mean, I've very much, been interested in the way that can you extend some of the ideas around the C-59 sort of greenwashing into some responsibility washing. There's all kinds of washing going on in AI right now, and so but we don't know that because we don't have good transparency obligations. We don't have reports back from AI companies around how their algorithms and models are working. We don't have the ability to then look at how different types of algorithms might interact with one another in ways that kind of create these types of collusions. So I would love to see sort of a lot more, transparency, disclosure, ability to do, auditability, access for independent researchers that feels foundational to everything right now. It lays the foundations on which a lot of these other forms of research can occur. And I mean, I really worry also about, I guess the piece that I think about is because there's this kind of constant creeping along different elements of value chains, both at a vertical level as well as at a horizontal level, thinking about how that dominance ends up kind of extending in potential ways that just kind of continually erode competition feels very concerning to me. So being able to, this idea of being able to do proactive market research, which is part of what happens in the EU's mandate right now. I really hope to see that here. And my understanding is that the Bureau does have some of the language for that, but doesn't have language around what significant interest is and control around how some of the controls are existing around AI and competition, and that without that, it may be hard to enforce some of those.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I see a lot of questions about like SMEs. We're going to come back to this, but maybe just before this, Vas, could you talk a bit about like how you see like the role of, the role of AI and the disruption of like market power in Canada, like globally, and what could be done maybe to mitigate this?
The what can be done to mitigate is so fascinating. Stanford's AI index sort of every year calibrates, top models and things like that. And I was fascinated to learn that the model Grok on X is actually quite an impressive LLM. So yes, there is still, I don't know to what extent it's fair to say this kind of illusion, right? More superficial, kind of more arms race kind of competition that's going on. What Denise and I found is that, AI is framed as a disruptive force with a lot of promise. I think we saw that captured quite well in the New York Times column this weekend from Kevin Roos that sort of set people alight in terms of his predictions for what's just around the corner for us with AI, right? And how realistic is that, and who's hyping these possibilities and promises that may not come true. So what Denise and I found is more around, how does AI in terms of production, and models and inputs kind of entrench the power of dominant digital firms that we've already seen, right? Rather than creating more competition. Often some of that competition we've seen is the result of people using OpenAI's API, right? So we're kind of white labeling or kind of dressing up a lot of downstream products. In our very brief chapter on AI and the big fix, we take a look at how AI's reliance on massive data sets, all the stuff we kind of already know, right? Computational resources and proprietary infrastructure kind of gives that structural or reinforces that structural advantage. Don't forget, these firms also own cloud services, train the most advanced AI models, and control the access points for businesses looking to integrate AI. When Premier Ford, is it a couple of weeks ago now, or was it just last week? Honestly, my sense of time is horribly skewed in this timeline. When he threatened to cut off electricity access, other competition friends were sort of talking about, okay, what would it mean if a form of retaliation was a private firm choosing to constrain or throttle computational cloud, right? Which our SMEs and larger businesses are reliant on and entangled with, right? And how far away are we from that kind of dystopia? No, I don't believe the state can compel that. But when you think about how our economies are so interdependent, it's not just the physical goods, right, that are flowing across the border multiple times. There are fascinating interdependencies and reliance on these digital infrastructures, which goes to some of what Renee was reminding us about, right, in terms of alluding to sovereignty, and also sovereignty and kind of the associated mechanics. So I guess that's the big question, right? Does AI open markets, break them open? How promising is it? Or is it reinforcing monopolies and dominance, right? We've talked about how it allows incumbents to extract more value from cultural industries and kind of reshape those markets. We talked about how it's used in anti-competitive applications, arguably, right? Even to surface the elements like self-preferencing, which we have not had a great conversation about in Canada. Again, one of the many opportunities for us that's still there. And when firms face the enormous cost of infrastructure and compute infrastructure, it makes it nearly impossible for those smaller firms to consider accessing that market, whether or not they're aspiring to be gobbled up in kind of a killer acquisition as well. So right now it seems like AI is often pitched as a productivity booster. I think in this moment for Canada, we're so desperado for those productivity boosts that we are simultaneously kind of pushing ahead, encouraging our firms to adopt this productivity enhancing technology in ways big and small, while also, tripping over ourselves, stumbling and kind of falling down, trying to regulate the composition, right, and application of AI, and failing. So that's my sort of rambly, longer answer in terms of like, where are we and where do we want to go moving forward? And will we view a reintroduction of any legislation related to AI writ large as something that's just too risky because it will threaten, quote unquote, productivity, or it will threaten growth? I'll sort of end by, like, don't forget the late 90s official policy position of permissionless innovation, right? In the US, that certainly we had echoes here. We took our hands off the wheel very like, if you watch Power Rangers, like make my monster grow moment. Let's see what happens. You know, don't get in the way. Gross. Well, now we're trying to get in the way, right? And it's difficult, and it reduces and erodes trust in the state because of those regulatory lags and those ambiguities, right? Um, are we entering a moment or an era? Those are two very overused words right now, so sorry for that. But are we entering a time of irresponsible innovation, right? Where we will rationalize, you know, either through the austerity in the US, we will rationalize the application of more surveillance tech, right? More uh, displacement, direct displacement of jobs, more kind of, I don't know, you know, if we don't have the guardrails in place now and we don't have a hope of getting them in the near future, then what is it going to mean and what is it going to look like to innovate? And was responsible innovation just something that sounded good, but no one ever really knew what it was?
I mean, that's a great question, especially regarding AI after the Paris, AI summit. This was
Mm,
exactly what, JD Vance, announced to the crowd, also with like kind of some threats to like governments,
right.
in the EU, and I would say also to Canada, like don't even think about, regulating us. If you try to regulate basically American companies, we're gonna come after you. So that might also be something to take into account. But Canada has been always taking it into account, like the threat of the US kind of like a countermeasures or to any regulation. But yet today we're like where we at. Maybe it's time to look beyond this, but it's quite complex when we talk about like industrial policy and question policy. But I think Renee, you wanted to do some maybe follow up on what Vas said, and maybe also like Jennifer, and then I will go to some of the questions we received from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we're looking at the providers, I mean, one of the things that we don't really understand right now is how some of these applications are going to end up sort of being sustainable, because of course, OpenAI has just introduced this $20,000 a month price point, and that
Right.
type of change may end up leading to an unpredictability for companies who become dependent on these models, and just that may end up just forcing them to be acquired in ways that really are and not in the interest of competition. So that's the kind of thing that I worry about a lot. And in this conversation around, we've ended up in this false binary of innovation versus regulation. I really feel like there's something in between there, and that is never the framing. These framing conversations are all about you need to get on board or get left behind, and it sort of ends up just leading to this notion that the only option is to get on board what is already happening the way it is already happening and not get in the way. I really hope and see an opportunity for Canada and other like-minded economies to compete on sustainability and on responsibility. And especially in this particular moment, Canada can't go it alone. It can't go against the US on its own. But what if you have other secondary market economies, including the EU, but also South Korea, Japan, Brazil. There's lots of other countries who do not share the US's vision of the world in its current form. How do we build stronger alliances with those countries, start to build alternative infrastructures, and also not just like competition based? I mean, I know, Jennifer, you sort of set the context at the beginning, but there's a whole other movement around digital public infrastructure that is really very much trying to get into building alternatives that are public interest oriented. I hope that we can start to look at some of these infrastructures as ways to start to build a foundation that is a little bit healthier. So I think there's different ways to achieve this, and it's not just we definitely don't get there by playing into the narratives of the big tech organizations who just want to, one of whom wants to dominate the world and possibly space.
But they are being echoed here, right? They're
Hmm.
not, they may originate from some of the largest American technology companies, but there is certainly a contingent, very vocal contingent in Canada who's been more than happy to kind of echo and amplify that standpoint too. Sorry, Jennifer, you're being so patient, but we're allowed to just jump in.
It's fine.
That's
It's fine.
he said.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm
Jennifer.
going to jump in with my the point that I raise often, and then everyone starts to roll their eyes. You know, I'm going to come back to the original point, which is the whole idea of competition law is predicated on the idea of market capitalism being the preferred system for allocating resources, scarce resources, in a way that promotes the greatest good. However, those are value-laden statements, and I think that one of the things that we don't talk about enough is the firm belief that private incentives, which are directed at, private profit, right? Is that a sufficient way to ensure that technology, that business solutions, that allocation of resources, that the direction of the economy goes in the way that is consistent with what we believe is important? I cannot answer that question on behalf of everyone. When I've appeared before parliamentary committees, the committee members are all looking at us. I'm like, look, that's your job. You were elected to do this. But I think the larger point is, we've always believed that there are moments and time periods, but also just sectors where this market capitalist approach does not satisfy all the requirements we have. The challenge has always been to find agreement and consensus on how we go about that. And there's been a lot of talk, this is going to be my little screed, about red tape and regulatory burden. And Canada is like way down on the list in terms of regulatory burden because it's got too many regulations and so on. Well, some of that's the product of federalism, some of that's the product of some other things. But my concern with that is that it's not per se the fact that we want to put framework or parameters around things. It's, we have to do it thoughtfully. And I think that indecision produces a regulatory burden because we're trying to please too many people. We're trying to compromise. We're not making priorities. And if there's one thing that Canada will, in this moment, have to do, is it will have to decide what are the most important things. And that will have consequences, and not everyone's going to agree. I mean, we've seen it right now. Pipelines are suddenly, the priority. I mean, rightly or wrongly, I'm not, an expert on that, but I think the moment has sharpened the importance of making choices. But I will say this, that regardless of the way we go in terms of what sectors and so on, I think that it's a fantasy. And OpenAI is a good example. It is a fantasy to believe that private enterprise will ever care about anything other than private economic gain. And as long as we do go into that with clear eyes, then if you want to protect the public interest, the public, through their governments and other institutions, have to guard that. If you think for 5 seconds that, a company that in our corporate law system is built this way, there is no limit on growth. We have a very permissive business system, a priori. Don't think for 5 seconds they're going to care about you. And you shouldn't be surprised. So, my answer to, don't interfere with the golden goose. Well, yeah, but who's getting the golden goose and who's getting the benefit? And ultimately, we have to be masters of our own destiny that way. But that takes some courage and some willingness to maybe suffer some short-term consequences while we restructure things. But I mean, to believe that we can rely on private capitalists, whatever their size is, to make the right choices for us, forget it.
But that's what we were trying to do with privacy legislation, right?
Yeah,
I talk
it
about
didn't
this
work
with my policy students. No, I know, but we're as policy designers, policy thinkers, like we're not in customer service, right? We're not in pleasing everyone. And my students will sometimes insist to me, this takes a balanced approach. And I'm like, great, what does that mean? Why? Why do we want a balanced approach in this case? Are we trying to make everyone happy? It doesn't often work. Sometimes you have to think about, okay, if certain stakeholders are disgruntled or upset, was that anticipated? Can it be mitigated, right? Can it be sort of previewed? But maybe it's a Canadian thing sometime where we think, the best thing to do is something that's satisfying for everyone. And we get, proposals that either don't go anywhere or don't make sense. But we also need to start somewhere, and not always be kind of tabula rasa and be like, what does everyone think? Because it's a lot of work. It's a certain form of work that certain groups and professionals are much better positioned to contribute to and take advantage of. No, not making excuses for myself for not writing in Renee, you're being patient.
Oh, yeah,
I bet I
no.
could still submit something just a year late, you know?
No, I mean, I think I mean, we very much saw like how in the EU's, submissions around the AI Act, that the perceptions that were submitted by civil society, differed very significantly from those of industry. But that said, I think that there's also been interesting approaches to try to look at how do you bring some of those conversations together. I thought one of the more recent examples I saw in the EU was as some of the rules were changing around sustainability. There was an attempt to try to harmonize the sort of regional level sustainability rules with the national level obligations to make it simpler for businesses to kind of to be sustainable but not have this overly burdensome regulatory environment. So I mean, I think that there are ways to try to simplify regulatory environments while being responsible. And yes, I agree that there's not everything is going to end up being dealt with by markets, especially when you are in a situation where there's such a significant concentration of power. I mean, we saw with X, a lot of people made the choice to leave X when Musk won the election. A lot of people have chosen to sell their stock and their Tesla cars. There's no current alternative to Facebook, so there's not really a place to go to. And all the meanwhile that we are sort of using that platform, the data that is being used in that model is being used to train AI models. And in the meantime, there's the lack of choice is kind of creating an environment in which there's just increasing threats to our digital ecosystems and environments. I mean, if we look at what's happening right now around the information integrity online, the amount of fake content and assets and undetectable interference, it
But
is a
but
threat.
advertisers are coming back to X because they want to kiss Musk's ring, right? And show allegiance to the king, right? So that's another element. I mean, I think the Competition Bureau in the misinformation era, we know Policy Horizons, oh God, was it 2 years ago now or a year ago? They said, one of the nearest, most likely disruptions is that people won't be able to tell what's real and what's fake. And we're already there, right? The Bureau has to deal with economic misinformation, the gap, the gulf between, the claims that companies make and what's actually true. And that's probably pretty exhausting for them. You have to think that political misinformation that's uh, more damaging and maybe more intentionally misleading or health misinformation is, that it all starts to get wrapped up together in terms of what people experience and what they resent. You mentioned digital public infrastructures. Yes, there are micro movements and we need more of it, but the quote unquote builders in Canada don't seem to be thinking of that sort of stuff, right? Like what do we need help with? We need centralized wait lists for childcare that take the administrative burden off nonprofit enterprises and introduce transparency for people. Why did we hand over the digitization of the labor market to private companies, right? Why is that the domain of Microsoft, through LinkedIn and Indeed? This should be Canada's job board, whatever that was, whatever that still is, because it seems to have some marginal utility. Canada should own the digital infrastructure of the labor market. Canada should ensure transparency in terms of where and how jobs are posted. Canada should have the direct information in terms of the fastest growing skills and where they are and the newest skills and all those things. And instead, we've allowed that to be privatized too. And I think that's so fascinating and such a miss. That's wild.
And I mean, I think as this advances, so many other areas that are, that would be in the area of public interest are going to get absorbed by private interest. I mean, we're starting to see more and more private applications in schools and in other environments that would typically be public. So our public spaces are becoming privatized, even if our policies haven't driven that. So that is a shift that I don't think a lot of people are awake to.
It sort of feeds
No,
into the
absolutely.
larger point. I'm going to just say one thing, Clay, and then I'll let you go to the question.
Go. No
But
worries.
it's the larger question about liberty, right? I mean, I think that what's the attraction of privatizing, going private, doing these things, is that you feel that you have the freedom then to shamelessly pursue your self-interest without regard to others. because the only regard to others is that which comes through regulation. And I think there is a role for education and, training the citizens of the world, making them informed and making them aware. I mean, this all is, I suppose, obvious to some people, right? We exist in a world where we have rights that are constrained by our obligations and our duties to others. But it seems like, the tenor of the way people talk about power, the way some of the most powerful people are talking about power, and the fact that they, because of that power, are accountable to no one and have actually no obligation, you know, uh, that sort of creates a space where that now has become the floor instead of, we actually all should be acting in a way that's above that floor. But if we are in a world now where everything is permissible if it isn't expressly prohibited or somehow controlled, sends the message. And I mean, I think it's the Bureau that said this. I can't remember if it's Matt Boswell who did, the commissioner, but we cannot enforce ourselves out of this problem. We cannot find non-compliance with rules as a way to establish the standards because enforcement is a tiny, tiny percentage of what's going on. What you want is to create an environment where you are rewarded or at least not, discouraged or otherwise disadvantaged because you do the right thing. And that's why we care about misleading advertising, for example, because we don't want the ones who are actually doing the effort to lose the customers to those who are cheating. But, that sounds really simple. It's not as simple as it is. But I think that there's a larger sort of conversation, and we're never going to have enough rules to tell people how to behave in every micro situation. What we have to give people, especially the young people of this world, and I have 3 teenagers, is what are the tools for how you should conduct yourself in this world. Even if you want to, generate new things, create new things, innovate. Of course, people want to make money. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to say it's that we need to be aware that there should be some understanding that there's a context and there's like a balance that's happening there in terms of like the naked pursuit of just my self-interest. But you see it everywhere. You see it in entertainment, you see it in culture, you see it in the political discourse, so it's not as though the economy is just, the monetary reflection of that, I would say.
No, absolutely. And like to link back to what Vas mentioned earlier, like one of the issue also is like the informational asymmetry, beyond enforcement. We need to be, to be able to know what is actually like happening, especially as like more and more like, what was or what should be, dealt with by the state, by the administrative state is like delegated to like, private organization to platforms. We have an issue to know what's happening, and especially like in Canada with, I know people might be tired of hearing me about like the trade secret provision in the criminal code, but we imported without the exception, but we have big issues. Like we don't protect enough whistleblowers in Canada, and we need them like more than ever in the public sector, in the private sector, to be able to like come, come forward without being threatened by like, lawsuit and like criminal like prosecution on some of those aspects, or like, algorithmic misinformation, etc. So it's kind of like all comes back to those kind of framework, where, like for the for the ecosystem, for like the market, but it goes beyond just like economic issues. It moves toward like societal issues like democratic uh, issues, and some of the, and maybe one of the, I mean, we already answered like some of the question from the audience with like the conversation, but maybe one thing we kind of mentioned at several like moment, but we don't really like deep dive on is, Canadian SMEs and how to protect them. And there's been a lot of conversation, like, in the US, in the EU, or like with some of the rules against like killer acquisition kind of fired back. We've actually like, because an acquisition was like rejected by the European Commission, basically the startup also like just died because they needed like the fresh influx of funds. So yeah, do you think that the Canadian approach to competition is sufficient to protect our SMEs, or like what could be done, what should be done? Is there like a jurisdiction from which we can learn best practices in the matter? I don't know, like
Well,
if
I mean,
Renee, yeah,
we've been, yeah,
that's
Renee, go.
no,
No, Renee's more polite than I am. So Renee, you go, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that something I'm appreciating seeing is some of the trust and safety folks, for example, looking at platforms, have been working on creating open source tools to do some of that work to in order to be able to do that. But like, so how could we, I appreciate that they're trying to do that, because it's very challenging for new platforms to come online and then create their own new trust and safety infrastructure, and it costs them money. They have to have a commitment to actually doing it, but that's why we also need some trust and safety infrastructure that's kind of for the auditability side, for people who are trying to monitor those efforts. So, I think that like reducing the cost by kind of creating open source infrastructures can help. I think that that's one way that can do that, and creating more oversight on that. And I mean, on the comment about whistleblowers, I mean, the Ethan Zuckerman bill in the US on the platform Accountability and Transparency Act, and very specifically included provisions for whistleblowers, and I strongly believe that that should be a part of a Canadian obligation.
Absolutely. That's something we've been discussing for maybe a new online harm bill that should have strong protection for like tech workers and like
I
kind
hate
of
to rain on your
like
parade, but the evidence shows that most people don't like whistleblowers, in fact. So we like the abstract idea, but people who are actually whistleblowers tend to come out poorly,
Well,
regardless of the reform.
Retweet,
So we have to be careful what we
retweet.
wish for.
Yeah, no,
that
that's fair.
may be true,
No,
but right now, one of the issues is that, for example, non-permissioned research in the US, Meta has gone after and sued one of the researchers there that had actually been doing some research to uncover the fact that the ad libraries that Meta puts out actually were not properly representing the kinds of ads that
exactly.
seeing. And so even if their perceptions of whistleblowers are not great, we still need them to ensure that people can do that research and not get sued out of existence.
so
That's
some of the research that Denise has done in the U.S. And it's a little older now, but it holds true, is around access to market. So there's a kind of subset of the American Economic Liberties Project, and we have good conversations in Canada about access to markets, access to capital, right? For early stage startups, it's really tricky. No one's really on the bank's asses to improve how they're lending, so people are going to alternative models. In all the conversation about tariffs right now, and like the 80s are back, right? Sovereignty is back, national champions are coming back. Our, how we're looking inwards is sort of also maybe shifting our competition conversation sometimes. You want to talk tariffs, you want to talk taxes, you want to talk tolls. You would think that a country where 99.7% of businesses are SMEs, right? There'd be national outrage that in the first half of 2023, Amazon extracted 45% of seller revenue. This is from the Stacy Mitchell work, right? That those fees that they're charging independent merchants to be on their platform, to be part of their ecosystem that they own and operate and manipulate and sell access to, that those fees have risen sharply. Why? Has it gotten more expensive for them to set that market, right? A market that's not a free market, that is a highly regulated market, regulated by them, right? Um, there's a larger cut of each sale that goes away from independent merchants, small and medium-sized enterprises, referral fees, fulfillment services, sort of all these elements. So why is it so hard for small businesses to be more productive in Canada? I don't know, maybe because when they're in e-commerce, almost half of their revenue is getting siphoned off by big tech. To me, that is a freedom, sovereignty, almost a tariff conversation, right? That we're not really having. And we know that the research is there, and we know that sellers are often fearful of stepping out or speaking out about the negative externalities of having access to this platform that is also incredible and allows them to do business, arguably all over the world. So I'm not saying that a public policy should be get off Amazon, go more direct to consumer, take your store just to Shopify, but I'm saying those are the structure and terms of marketplaces are an important part of the conversation, not just looking at the numbers of competitors. And if we can't shift and change that market, we have to be realistic about how confining it is and whether it's helping us achieve what we really want to achieve.
No, exactly. And just to come back, we might disagree on this, Jennifer, but and I think Renee might be with me on this for the production of like whistleblower, security researchers and like academic researchers, thanks to whom we know the reality of the ecosystem that was like they might have a bad reputation, but often because of like narratives built by the PR teams of those big technology. Like regulators know things thanks to them. It's not because like of some voluntary disclosure from the big tech that the bureau can do this or the privacy commissioner can do things like this. It's like public servants in the federal government, like in the US and Canada, like came forward to like mention that we have DPIs, but they're actually like managed by those big corporations and they in violation of privacy laws and stuff. So there is like room. We need to be very careful on how to carve out, obviously, those exemption. But yeah, we need to stop maybe like criminalizing those kind of behaviors to protect like a few and like basically add more obscurity, at least in my opinion, like in the ecosystem. So I think like we had a lot of questions and I was going through the question and we kind of like answered them, I think, through our conversation, like a lot about like, sovereignty, what Canada can do in the interesting times we in, especially with like some of the uncertainties of the domestic political landscape, and also like the interface between the provinces and the federation. And maybe in the last minute that we have together, I would like to ask you, like the three of you, let's imagine you have direct access to policymakers. So we have like a new parliament on Monday or like in a month if an election is called like over the weekend. What would be like your call to actions? Kind of like one or two things that the Kenyan government could do so within, the federal government. So within the limitation of what they can do under the constitution. But like, yeah, what should they do? What could they do to maybe mitigate some of the harm, some of the risk, and like support Kenyan ecosystem, like the digital sovereignty of the country? If there is anything, let's try to be hopeful and saying like there is solutions we could find like coming together. Maybe Renee, if I can start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. I think foundationally, we really need some of these transparency obligations, and that can be useful for competition bureaus, but it can also be useful for, future AI acts and future online harms bills, whatever they may be. I think that some of these obligations are going to differ by the type of bureau that we're looking at, but in this particular case, it's sort of, trying to understand, first of all, where, how these markets are impacting on competition on small businesses, how they're sort of eroding the ability of other sort of people within their ecosystems to be competitive and sustainable. I think that looking at there's the Competition Bureau itself can do some of that proactive research, and so we really would love to see that. But so that proactive research combined with transparency obligations and sort of so a protective environment for people who are thinking about what's in the public interest.
Awesome. Jennifer?
I guess one of the things that we don't have, which I think that the Bureau can do some of this work, but not all of it. I'll say a couple of things. We need Canada-specific information, Canada-specific data that researchers can look at, that public policy analysts can look at. And, part of the reason we don't have that data is, what Vaz is alluding to, but I think partly it's also that we're not actually collecting it and looking at it. And so the market study powers are among the powers available to the Bureau to look at those things. But of course, the market study has to be related, somehow to the mandate of the commissioner. I think you have other agencies in the Digital Regulators Forum, which is this combination of federal regulators. So it's the CRTC, the Privacy Commissioner, and competition, and I'm forgetting now. Oh, and procurement, I think, is the other one. We haven't talked about procurement as another way that you could encourage and use the power of the public purse as a way to perhaps foster some of this sovereignty, some of these investments, and so on. I'm not saying we suddenly become a command economy where it's all coming from the public side, but I think we haven't thought about how we can leverage some of those tools. So there has to be a transversal approach. That is to say, we have to be thinking about these things across more than one agency, across more than one department. And that will require some unity of purpose and some vision, which at the present time is impossible given the state of the current government. But one can hope that whoever is going to form the new government will be alive to the importance of these things. There are, I think, some other things. We haven't talked a lot about the provinces, and I really think, although competition has been recognized as a legitimate federal area of competition, consumer protection is definitely provincial, but there are many other sectors that are affected by AI, or that there are questions related to how innovation in AI and how the economy related to AI
Exactly.
matters, that is provincial. And we don't really have a forum where those conversations are happening. And I think that if we look at securities regulation, for example, which is the example I pull out of my mouth all the time, that's a complex area that constantly evolves, that's all about the money. We have, for better or for worse, a multiplicity of regulators who have to coordinate. They do it. They manage, right? So I think it's possible to imagine how these things could move forward. It cannot be simply one agency. It cannot be simply through one lens, but there does have to be some choices about what's important. I think that the final thing I would say is that at the end of the day, we do have to have some idea about what's important, and we cannot do everything. There are some questions that are going to be much harder, like the mid-level funding question, like how do you create an ecosystem where people can actually, scale up or get out if they want and sell, and you keep the technology here. That's a more complex question. You can't just wave a magic wand for that. But I do think fundamentally we have to think about what we want, and then we can figure out the rules that come with it. The idea that we come up with a set of rules, and then all these good things will happen is just, that's not the way it works. You have to have the vision first. And there was a real allergy to talking about values in the context of the competition reform. And I think that was a mistake. So I think in the context of AI and this larger discussion, I think we have to come back to what's important. Of course, we want prosperity. We also want respect for human dignity and for, who we are as people. We have to make some choices. We have to decide how we're going to do that.
Yeah. I mean, we should
That's
also probably stop asking academics for policy ideas. I'm just kidding. But in
I've
terms
said
of,
that so many times to Parliament. It's like,
but
hello, you were elected, not me.
it's interesting to see where voices are privileged and maybe overprivileged sometimes. So I'm sort of half saying that as a joke. I mean, I don't have a silver bullet that I'm like sitting on. I don't know why I'm combining those to offer that imagery, but I do think Canada could be more kind of comprehensivist, right? That's sort of what we put forward in the Big Fix too, that a lot, taking a more expansive approach in terms of who's responsible for ensuring and protecting and remaking markets so that they're competitive should be more expansive than it is right now. That's how you include a role for the provinces in these super teeny tiny things, right? Province of Ontario was consulting on whether insurers can vertically integrate with pharmacies. Quebec explicitly prohibits that. Province of Ontario is putting forward a proposed amendment to the Consumer Protection Act that makes it harder to trap people in subscription trap. It's an echo of Lena Khan, believe it or not, under Premier Ford, to say it's got to be as easy to unsubscribe as it is to subscribe. Does that revolutionize the marketplace and restore prosperity to Canada? Absolutely not. But it shows us that the state has our back and is putting a foot down and introducing appropriate guardrails to markets that are really difficult to play that other side, right? Quebec, the only province that mandates per unit pricing. When you're doing grocery shopping, is that going to restore prosperity to Canada? No, but it really helps people when they're trying to save money in their comparison shopping. So I do think that Canada can think bigger by asking what are those smaller things that are modest but meaningful that we can do in aggregate. By the way, one of the last thing former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did was an order in council that capped insufficient banking fees at $10. Now you could say, we could hem and haw and be like, why didn't you do that sooner? It was in Freeland's wool mandate letter for quite some time. Yeah, it was. But kind of a statement that on the way out, he stepped up, stepped in, and capped something that the banks were pretty easy to see. And you can look at Andrew Spence's excellent book, Fleeced, or just general comparisons of how those fees are the highest. And I tried to game that out too and be like, okay, Bass, like, do you have enough policy empathy here? Like, what's the counter argument? Do these fees have to be, there's a threshold of how high they have to be to sufficiently deter people from not having enough fees in their bank accounts? And it's just like, holy Toledo, this who does this disproportionately hurt and harm? So does that revolutionize Canada's economy and restore prosperity and make us more competitive? No, but it protects people who need it and intervenes where I think a market was failing vulnerable people. That's competition policy. And that's I think a better version of competition policy that we've seen sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And you highlight, and you all highlighted, like it needs to be kind of a wall of government and wall of society approach, and like all level of governments have like
Yeah.
their role in this policy, and maybe we need to have like more collaboration. And like I know in
Small
the on the
things.
privacy
Yeah.
space, they have like that kind of collaboration, and also journal investigation and stuff. And so yeah, it might be time, especially as provinces like Ontario, Quebec, or want to protect more the ecosystem, vis-a-vis the US. There might be things to do, but linking back also to some of the things that I think it's you, Vasu, you mentioned, like the need for like kind of so legal certainty and kind of coherence in our like digital policies, conversion policies. We need a wall of government. It's not true, but like we need a wall of governments, wall of agencies and department approach to this, because at the moment each department come with their own approach, taking into account like their own stakeholders, either like cultural industries or like other kind of like industries for I said and stuff. And it's kind of like piecemeal approach doesn't make like a lot of sense on the global stage, neither like on the domestic stage. And Jennifer,
Yeah.
we were mentioning about like the kind of, I don't want to say balance, but kind of like between
No, don't say
economic
balance.
prosperity. No, I know, I know. I don't want to say,
No,
but like,
no,
no, no,
no
no. We
balance.
have economic
Everything's out of
prosperity
balance.
and society, and we need to like find a way to reconcile both. And like, when the next government will like make proposal to make sure that all of the stakeholders are taking into account, and like, even if we need to protect, the Canadian ecosystem vis-a-vis the US, we also need to think about like Canadians and the
Well,
society to like protect
we
them for like little things, but super important things like pricing and stuff that Vas mentioned.
we have no sense of national pride in terms of interesting like competition policies that we've done as a country, right? We are so quick to SHIT on our supply management system, right? Like, sorry, we set a wage floor for farmers. We know that there have been two formal contestations of supply management, or however you say that word, under whatever the free trade agreement used to be that we had with the US, right? American monopolists want to come here, American monopolists who are subsidized far more than we subsidize Canada's industry. Oh, how's it going in the US when it comes to eggs in particular? Has anyone heard? Is that the model that we kind of want here? And yet we say to ourselves and each other, oh, we legislated a cartel. Can you believe we did that? Does that system deserve to be revisited, recalibrated? Should we maybe relax supply management on the products of milk like cheese? Sure, that would be an interesting conversation, but we do need to be ready as a country to defend policy choices and provocations that we put forward, like the digital sales tax. The digital streaming tax is being heard at the Supreme Court, right? That is us trying to rebalance power and kind of help the marketplace. Are we going to walk away from that and say that it's either a bargaining tool or that we're overstepping? Like, these are important elements too that, I don't know, it's places I'm obviously anxious about because I interrupted you and you were trying to conclude, but like, it's part of our work as Canadians to really understand and appreciate what those policy proposals mean for us.
No, but I think also it's like a good example to maybe end our conversation. And so first,
Okay,
like
sorry.
we need more conversations about this. This is an example, like we need to have Canadian specific conversation about like the needs of the country and what we can do in the complex constitutional and geopolitical like landscape we live in. But no, that's what you just mentioned, that is obviously like super important. But yeah, like for the digital service tax, I don't want to like we don't have time to go on this, but there was maybe other ways to be more like comprehensive in thinking the way we tax goods and services rather than like targeting, a specific set of actors that now is kind of like firing back. So that's why I think like we need to have that kind of like broader conversation, taking into account like a whole ecosystem and not just some specific policy from a specific department. But I guess that's for another conversation because we just arrived out of time. So thank you so much, Renee, Jennifer, and Vas for joining me today in conversation. I loved it. Clearly, we need more of those. Thank you so much for people in attendance. I hope you enjoy as much. I think we enjoyed the four of us to be chatting about this. And also, I would be remiss to not thank like my team, so Courtney at the AN Society Initiative and Alicia at the Center for Law, Technology and Society, who help us making this event like a reality and worked on the logistics in the back end. So thank you all. It was a pleasure to have you with us today. And yeah, let's chat more about competition in Canada. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.